are trying to bring this pandemic under control, the economic impact continues to heighten public anxiety. This as tens of thousands of businesses have folded, more than 760,000 Malaysians are currently unemployed, and 1 million more at risk of pay cuts and no pay leave. Yesterday, Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin unveiled yet another round of economic relief to help deal with the economic impact of the second MCO. But the question is, does it hit the mark? And do we have a game plan for a long-term economic recovery? Joining us on the line now, we have Ong Kian Ming. He's the MP for Bangi and former Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry. Good evening, Kian Ming. Now, what was your initial response to yesterday's economic support measures?
I took a detailed look at the PERMI announcements by the Prime Minister. And when I looked at the 22 initiatives that he announced, I realized that many of them were actually repeated policies that were already in the 2021 budget, and that the 15 billion amount is overstatement, that the additional expenditure that is really in this announcement is probably less than 5 billion ringgit. And I think this amount is grossly insufficient to help businesses and individuals go through what I expect would be quite a lengthy MCO 2.0 lasting beyond the 2 weeks that have already been announced.
Kian Ming, is the reason for not so much a discrepancy between the headline numbers and the actual, perhaps, real additional fiscal injection into the economy? That discrepancy aside, what kind of limitations are there on government today? What kind of fiscal kind of wiggle room do they have, to sort of address these large issues, and what might be actually long-term issues? I mean, do they have deep enough pockets?
I think this is not the time for us to quibble about long-term issues such as credit ratings and whatnot, which was an area of focus by the finance minister when he talked about the budget and designed the 2021 budget last year. And we saw the result of what we thought was a relatively conservative budget, which didn't help our credit rating scenario, whereby we were downgraded by one of the credit rating agencies. So under this circumstance, when other governments around the world are spending a massive amount of government expenditure in order to help individuals and small businesses, we should not look at these kinds of constraints. When the Prime Minister can get an allocation of 35 million ringgit to build a couple of community halls in his area in Pago, I don't see why we cannot have larger spending initiatives to help the people who really need it, which are the SMEs and the individuals that are badly affected by this second lockdown.
Right. I understand the need to have financial aid to help the vulnerable absorb some of these short-term shocks that the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns have caused to people's livelihoods. But I'm wondering whether there's more than that. Is this government still thinking in terms of short-term shocks, or do we have a long-term recovery plan in place?
Yeah, I think, Melissa, you've hit the nail on the head. I think focusing on the PERMI initiative or the fiscal incentives and help alone, I think misses the larger point, which is whether this government has a comprehensive and coherent plan to battle this COVID pandemic, both from a health as well as an economic perspective. And I think from the early signs of the implementation and announcement of this MCO 2.0, there is very little that I can see that shows we have learned from the 9 months of having this facing this COVID. And in fact, I think many U-turns were made in the short 1 week period after the announcement of the MCO in terms of the sectors that were allowed to, and then later not allowed to, and then later on re-allowed to open, such as the automotive industry, and also the question of whether optometrists would be allowed to open or not. So that I think is one thing which really worries me as a policymaker, and ought to worry the larger public as well, because I think people can stomach probably having to go on this lockdown if, let's say, there's an assurance that the government has a plan moving forward that there would be an MCO 3.0 once MCO 2.0 is lifted. And I think right now, I think the public and also policymakers such as myself need a lot more convincing.
Kevin, what are the imponderables and uncertainties that that policymakers like yourself and those in government have to consider, or in fact have to kind of admit they cannot fully understand? I mean, is it any government at this point in time really hamstrung by the fact that we don't know to what extent the global recovery, the trajectory of the global recovery, to which, say, the Malaysian economy might be inextricably hitched?
We can't predict what will happen in terms of the COVID response, whether the vaccines will be effective in places like the United States or in Europe. But what we can do is to have a better control and to have better sense of policies within Malaysia itself. And I think this is one area where a lot more can be done. So you ask what can policymakers ask for? I think one thing that we can ask for is greater transparency and sharing of data. And this is the reason why I issued a press statement yesterday asking the DG 10 relevant data-related and policy-related questions to do with COVID. For example, we focus a lot on the number of new cases new positive COVID cases that are published every day. But how about the testing capacity? How many tests are done, every day? Have we reached the limit of our testing capacity? What is the positive rate of tests, COVID positive tests on a daily basis? With more transparency on these matters, I believe very much that we'll have a better idea of the kind of policies that can be put in place in order to have a long-term plan, or at least a plan within this year to bring down the numbers on a sustained basis, rather than having us lurch from one MCO to another.
Well, I'm glad, Keming, that you brought up that letter, because when I read it, those 10 questions, I think I was also quite curious to know, have you received a response from MOH or DG Hisham in response to some of the 10 questions that you posed?
I've not received any official response from the government yet, but the good thing about publishing such a statement is that I've received feedback from other people who share similar concerns with me, and have also clarified certain matters to do with testing capacity, for example. I just got an update to let me know that our testing capacity, daily testing capacity, is actually more than 60,000. This is on the part of MOH alone, not including the private sector. But MOH is only able to do about 30,000 tests per day. So where are the bottlenecks? Are the bottlenecks happening at the state level? Are they happening because of certain human resource constraints? So these are the kind of questions that we need to have more detailed answers on. Unfortunately, I can't ask these questions in Parliament because we are under an emergency, so Parliament is not convening. So we have to resort to other means in order to get answers to these important questions.
Well, Keming, since you brought up the emergency, what impact do you think the emergency is having on either investor confidence or even in terms of domestic businesses, wanting to invest and so on and so forth? I mean, do you think it has an impact? We've had senior ministers saying they don't think it has an impact.
Well, firstly, I think the emergency is totally unnecessary in terms of providing adequate tools for the government to fight this COVID pandemic. I think the MCO and the ordinances under the Infectious Disease Act is sufficient. And if, let's say, we are not able to come out with very concrete and coherent policies that involve the whole of government, whole of society, having the additional powers rising from an emergency wouldn't really help. And if, let's say, we cannot control this virus, we cannot control this pandemic, investor confidence will definitely be affected moving forward. So whatever FDI approved numbers that the Minister of Finance may want to announce, those will not be realized. And I think the business confidence level in Malaysia will continue to take a nosedive moving forward. The notion of this emergency, I think, is many people, especially those in the business sector, can see is purely for political purpose. And the idea that we need an emergency to solve this political crisis would further weaken investor confidence in Malaysia, because we have to resort to these measures in order to quote unquote protect the positions of some politicians.
We talk a lot about investor confidence, about business confidence, and I just want to get granular because you're the former Deputy Minister of MIPI. I want to better understand when we talk about business confidence, when we talk about fragile investor confidence or investor dissatisfaction. What are the trade-offs? What is it that we're worried about? Well, if this is perhaps a temporary, the shocks may be temporary, that the whole world is facing a global pandemic. What is it that we stand to lose if we don't build investor confidence?
That's an excellent question, Melissa. I think regardless of whether there's a pandemic going on or not, what investors want is consistent and predictable policies. But what a pandemic, such as the COVID pandemic, reveals is when you have a government that is unable to deal with the kinds of challenges in an uncertain policy environment, whatever inconsistent policies will exacerbate the kind of worries that investors, current as well as potential investors, would have in Malaysia. So, obviously, many people saw the message that went viral on how the CEO of the European Chambers of Commerce criticized the Minister of Finance post about heady, very positive 2020 approved investment figures from a foreign FDI perspective as well as a DDI perspective. But what investors here in Malaysia want is consistency in policies, and we have not really seen that happening under this COVID crisis.
Kian Ming, I want to tap you as MP of Bangi in your constituents. Do you think that they have basically been persuaded by the argument that having an emergency will lead to a better or a more efficient management of the pandemic? That seems to be the propaganda offensive that's on now, tying emergency powers with effective management of the pandemic. How are your constituencies responding to that? Whether
or not the emergency powers can be used in an effective manner to battle this COVID crisis remains to be seen, because we've not really seen concrete policies arising from these emergency powers. But what I can say is that many people are frustrated, including those in my constituency, about the inconsistent policies of the government. So, for example, having 9 months to learn from past perhaps mistakes, or perhaps having 9 months data from MySejahtera, I would have expected the government to be able to make a decision on whether, for example, optometrists can open or not under safe conditions. Right, but we saw again last-minute SOPs and last-minute changes in the SOPs, and these are the kinds of inconsistent policies and U-turns which frustrates many voters, and it doesn't give voters a sense of confidence that emergency powers or not, this government is capable and able to tackle the challenges associated with bringing down and controlling this COVID.
Kian Ming, thank you for your time. We appreciate your input, your insights to the show tonight. Thank you. We're going to take a quick break, but let's come back and talk about this issue a little bit more in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
COVID-19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to be vigilant to keep ourselves and others safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and when you're out, keep a safe distance. In fighting this virus, we can't relax, so don't be lax.
No, the war against COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to.
The second year of the pandemic, is the government's economic approach one that is still reacting to short-term shocks? Joining us on the line now, we have Yin Xiaolong. He's the Senior Research Associate at Khazanah Research Institute. Good evening, Xiaolong. Now, you co-wrote an opinion piece in which you claimed that Malaysia's financial aid and public health measures have been deployed in parallel ways rather than in unison. Now, I'm wondering, Xiaolong, in your mind, what would a synchronized approach with public health and financial aid, what would that look like?
Hi, good evening, guys. I think a synchronized approach would say let's rewind back a week to the original announcement that there was going to be an MCO in the economic heartland. And if things had been really synced up, I think we would have heard from the Prime Minister, yes, there's an initial decision in terms of public health to declare an MCO. And immediately following that, I think he would be able to announce all the economic relief packages or measures that people could expect to help them through this difficult time. And immediately following his address, I think all the relevant ministers should have come online to talk about the SOPs. The SOPs should have been ready to be dispersed on day one. Instead, unfortunately, what we saw was a sort of a drag over several days from the initial announcement to the actual instantiation of the MCO, and then SOPs were released, sometimes over 1 or 2 day period, and then sometimes changed again later. And then just yesterday, 1 week after the initial announcement, then we get the financial package. So, I think a way to look at it, it's like episodic TV, right? The old model is for episodes to come out once a week. You get left on a cliffhanger, and then in the meantime, you speculate, you discuss it with your friends, what might have happened. What we really need for pandemic communications is a sort of Netflix model. We want to be able to binge on all the episodes and have all the information at once. Because, if I'm running a business, or if I'm a worker, if I'm a self-employed person, I really need to know from the get-go, how do I prepare for this? How do I get ready for this? And for that reason, you need to have everything synchronized.
Xiaolong, thanks for bringing it back to popular culture. I want to ask you, though, in terms of the complexities of, say, the Malaysian state, whether, much of the problems lie in the fact that there's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach for the federation, which consists of the 3 main territories themselves, so diverse in terms of their needs, and then of course with the states, and how much are states not involved in this creation of some sort of coherent approach to both the public health measures as well as the question of financial need that is there on the ground?
From the sounds of it, it looks like states have a fair degree of autonomy on how to decide to respond. Like, Selangor is one I'm aware of. But I think the communication between the federal government and the state governments has improved since last year, where I think there was a recent meeting of the Mentris Besar and the Prime Minister where issues were discussed. Although it's not immediately clear to what degree there is sort of coordination all the way down from federal to state and local level on those kind of issues. sometimes I think federal has its own momentum, and the state governments also have those. I think it's important to ensure that everybody's on the same page. And that's why, in the article that my colleague Nazeha Muhammad Noor and myself wrote, we tried to emphasize the need for a grand plan. We need a grand narrative that we can all focus on, and that is the plan to get Malaysia out of the pandemic. And it's not just a health plan, it's also an economic plan and an overall all of government, all of society plan, because we are on the cusp of getting into year 2 of the pandemic now. We should have that plan, and that is the narrative that should be communicated, and that's the narrative that should pull all the disparate parts together, whether they be federal and state government or different ministries and agencies. And we should all be aware of how we're progressing and how we can contribute towards that.
All right, well, let's touch on that grand plan in a little bit, but I do want to come back and touch on something that you mentioned a bit earlier about the announcement of the lockdowns, the announcement of the SOPs, the delayed announcement of the SOPs, and then the subsequent revision of those SOPs. What has been the cost of all of that, including the announcement of an emergency? Is it just public confidence, business confidence, as you note in your opinion piece?
I think confidence may be one of the early casualties. Prior to that is uncertainty. And I think uncertainty about, does my business get to operate? Does it not? What will my cash flow be this month? How many workers can I keep on payroll? If I'm a worker, can I stay on the payroll? Do I still have a job at the end of this month? We took one hit last year. Can we take another hit this year when we were expecting and we were told that things would get better? I think that is one of the key problems that we face. And some businesses, some types of subsectors were told that they couldn't operate at the start of the MCO. Then after making that clear, there was some change, there was some turnaround, then they were allowed to operate. But sometimes that can cost you hundreds of millions of ringgit per day, when you're caught in limbo before a decision is made. And the question naturally comes forward, well, this is not our first time. We're not in January 2020 anymore. We're now in 2021. We've done this before. What's substantially different now about this MCO that certain sectors need to be re-reviewed if they were already given permission to operate in the last MCO?
Xiaolong, you perhaps unique in that you had a perspective from inside the machine. What do you think is going on? Why do we still have government struggling to standardize, SOPs, as you say, 9 months, 10 months after the pandemic, broke out here in Malaysia?
I mean, as you're alluding earlier, I used to work in, federal government as well as state government, and I think coordination and administration, they remain perpetual challenges for any organization, and particularly in something as big as government. And there's always an ongoing effort to try and make things work better, make things move more smoothly. And this is, whether it's coming from the Prime Minister, from the ministers, from the Chief Secretary of Government, who, holds a fair degree of power on these kind of things, down to the individuals, secretaries generals of the various ministries. It really is an ongoing process of trying to, make governance in Malaysia better. And I think the pandemic has tested this capability. And just yesterday I was wondering, because two of the issues that I work on are kind of more long-term issues like climate change and industrial policy, and they involve a multi-decade time frame. And it made me wonder if our administrative system and our social system was so strained by this experience of the pandemic, what can we actually bring to bear in terms of, say, addressing things like catastrophic climate change or the challenges of trying to get economically inclusive development on a widespread basis? So I think there really needs, you always need very alert managers and leaders who can tell where bottlenecks exist and try and resolve those bottlenecks through political will, rather than let things carry on as they were before. And it's no joke, because we're not the only country that's struggling, but some countries are clearly doing better, and it's important to sort of take lessons from there as well.
Right. Well, then, Xiaolong, I mean, what would you like to see as part of this grand plan, this grand narrative that you mentioned a little bit earlier? I mean, can you be specific and tell us what are you hoping to see? If you could advise the people in decision-making positions right now, what would you like to see in a national pandemic management approach?
I think first of all, we should make a heroic effort to avoid trying to call lockdowns and to prevent the need for lockdowns, and try and explore the avenue of greater testing and tracing as a result of that. Can we find ways to improve the data coming from MySejahtera? Because the impression I get is that it's largely going to the MOH contact tracers as a kind of raw data dump. They may have resolved that by now, but they've had to resort to the old school method of doing analog tracing, which clearly, it's not desirable in the digital age. Maybe we can do better there. Secondly, I think we should synchronize finance and health measures. Like I mentioned earlier, that they should be tightly coordinated. If you know that there's going to be a sort of health crunch coming, then get the finance ready. At the same time, thirdly, the financial firepower needs to be adequate. I think last year's budget was over-optimistic in how quickly and how successfully we could rebound in 2021. We didn't budget as much as we may have needed in order to drive a stronger recovery, even with last year's MCO, and let alone with the double MCO so far in the first month of this year. We just need more financial firepower coming in to support our, frontliners in MOH. We need to support the businesses, and we need to support workers and the people who are staying at home and finding it hard to make money.
Xiaolong, I understand that there was in fact a call for the budget to reflect at least like 6% of it going to the health system. That was not achieved by some accounts. But I do want to ask you about education, because it does seem that some of the long-term consequences of this particular year that we've had have fallen very heavily on the shoulders of young people in schools, and there seems to be a lack of coherence about whether schools are open, how they can be open, how we can level the playing field for in a country where the digital divide is a reality that's come to really impress itself upon us during this pandemic. I mean, do you have any thoughts about the whole question of education and this lost generation that we might in fact be seeing come to bear in a couple of years' time?
I think education, there are at least two areas in which it needs to intersect with any national grand plan. And the first is to try and figure out a way in which students can go back to school safely and get back to their educational sources. We need to also figure out ways in which we can maybe improve the infrastructure and the ability to observe the proper physical distancing and SOPs in schools. And the way in which the school term, when it starts, when it finishes, needs to be clearly communicated and synchronized with the national pandemic plan. And finally, on the education front, we need a recovery plan for education as well. We need to figure out what to do with all the kids who have had a year of lost education and possibly even another year of lost education. What is that going to do to this generation, to this cohort, when it finally comes to taking critical junctures like exams, like seeking work, like trying to get to university and so forth? What is going to happen to them, especially if they're from lower income classes and more disadvantaged families who may not have access to computing and digital online learning? That is a major, I think, future social problem that we are going to have to tackle.
Well, Xiaolong, thank you for joining us on the show tonight and sharing your insights, and thank you to you and the co-author of your opinion piece for writing that and highlighting that issue. Thank you for your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.